My name is Stella Rose. I am the youth advisor at Reverse the Trend. I also double as a full-time student here in New York City at Fordham University. So it's been a really fun journey trying to balance both hats. But today is really exciting for us because we are hosting a panel on, I think, a topic that is sort of now coming into fruition and under the microscope of states, parties, and civil society alike. And that is the gender perspective, but particularly pertaining to nuclear disarmament. Um, and with that being said, I wanted to also pay homage to the idea of this panel, which was inspired by a lot of the dialogues and events that were happening in the month of March, and particularly on International Women's Day. And it inspired us in the disarmament field to have this conversation, to have transparency, to talk openly and honestly about what are the stakes here for gender? What does it mean? What sort of implication does this have on gender? And ultimately, for everyone who's watching who isn't in the disarmament field, hopefully this might be enlightening on the intersection between two very important topics, such as disarmament and nuclear disarmament, and ultimately how gender plays a role. And so I just wanted to offer you, before we get started, that we have a few statistics, some of which are from the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and some of which are from a working paper from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, just to set the foundation of what this topic is at large. So bringing the gender perspective on nuclear weapons is important for a few reasons. The Security Council actually says that the pursuit of gender equality is relevant in every single action, ranging from elections to disarmament efforts. And so with this being said, some obvious key points that may come to mind when thinking about nuclear weapons and gender and the impacts that this has is perhaps the ionizing exposure, the nuclear fallout, what this means for health alike, but particularly the disproportionate impacts it has on women and girls and people with a uterus generally, is that this leads to higher rates of cancer. This is a more vulnerable population. And this is why gender needs to come into the perspective, into the question when thinking about nuclear disarmament. And additionally, I wanted to highlight a clause from the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or for the sake of time and the mouthful that that treaty is, we're just going to call it the TPNW from here on out. And that the treaty recognizes the necessity to rectify the historic and intergenerational health impacts of nuclear testing and use. For women in frontline communities, equal access to healthcare services and infrastructure is a critical step towards equality. So despite the disproportionate effects that nuclear testing has on women, the other side of this is now, how do we get the female voice into the room where it happens? Typically, and this is from the ICANN working paper, at any given meeting of international diplomatic meetings on nuclear weapons, only around a quarter of official country delegates are likely to be women. And they offer the statistic that less than a fifth of statements are likely to be given by a woman. And so the point of the conversation today is not only highlighting some female voices on our panel on what this means to them and what this means for disarmament at large, but ultimately, how can we progress this, not only from the spectators in civil society to those who are international service workers and UN workers. Hopefully this dialogue can highlight these different multifaceted stakes that are to be seen and discussed. So with that being said, I wanted to turn it over to our panel. We really do have esteemed speakers who are coming from a really diverse perspective, walks of life, cultural and national perspectives that I think are going to really enrich this dialogue. And so with that said, I wanted to offer the floor to our keynote speaker, Mr. Alonso Francisco Martinez Ruiz, who is the Counselor for Disarmament Affairs for the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva. Not to mention, Alonso is also the gender focal point of the TPNW. So with that being said, thank you so much, Alonso, and so excited to hear what you have to say today.
Well, thank you so much, Stella Rose, and obviously it's an honor to have been invited. I think, firstly, it has always been the interest of Mexico to promote education for disarmament, because we know the importance of involving youth in this area, which obviously it's one of the great challenges that humanity has with regard to the existence of nuclear weapons and its terrorific and catastrophic humanitarian consequences and environmental impact. So in that sense, it's an honor to participate in a youth-led event. As you well said, obviously Mexico was appointed and I was assigned to be the gender focal point of the TPNW. The TPNW, obviously, it's a pioneer treaty in regard of the recognition of the humanitarian consequence, but also of the gender impact of nuclear weapons. And this is born out of a history of a movement that tried to change the narrative of nuclear disarmament from a merely security perspective to one that it's more focused on what are the consequences to all humanity, but to specific populations, affected populations, being from the use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict, but also nuclear testing that, as we know, more than 2,000 nuclear tests have taken place. And most of the time, those nuclear tests were done in areas where the affected population was minorities and they're clearly or colonial territories, and therefore it had double discriminatory impact. And obviously, we need to start from today. I was also in a meeting and we were analyzing the 1987 WHO report on the health impacts of nuclear weapons. And I think that's kind of where the ball started rolling. And then obviously there was this basis to present an advisory opinion to the ICJ in the middle of the 1990s. And from there, it was consolidated up to a recognition of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences in the 2010 NPT review conference, and then the humanitarian conferences in Vienna, Nayarit, Oslo, and more recently Vienna before the MSP1 of the TPNW. So briefly, I would like to highlight three gender aspects that the TPNW envisages. And I think the first one is, as you very correctly said, the need to ensure the equal, full, and effective participation of both women and men, recognizing that it is an essential factor for the promotion and attainment of sustainable peace and security. I think here it is important to recognize that the TPNW during the negotiations was led by a woman. There were several women in the state representation that were also leading the process, and in civil society as very strong component of women, both of victim representatives and also civil society campaigners and persons. So I think that was certainly a distinctive factor in the TPNW. As you very well said, in the disarmament sector, still women are highly underrepresented, especially when you compare to other pillars within the work of the UN, human rights, environment, in which you generally tend to have some kind of equality represented, but in disarmament, it's still around 25% or less of women that participate in the fora, and even less which are leaders of their delegations. I think the second aspect that the TPNW highlights with regard to the gender impact is this disproportionate impact of women and girls, including as a result of ionizing radiation. I think there has been ample studies promoted from academia, from the ICRC, from the campaign, that have demonstrated the differentiated impact. But obviously, the the results are still not like we know for certainty the differentiated impact, but there's much more studies to be done and to further analyze and understand the impact. And it is important to recognize that the impact on health, physical health, but also the consequential mental health that accompanies this increased risk of physical harm to women, or as you said, those that have an uterus. And then I think the third aspect of the TPNW that it's important is the positive obligations, the victim assistance and environmental remediation that is highlighted in the TPNW. And here I think the Vienna Action Plan has built upon the obligation for the victim assistance that should adequately provide age and gender sensitive assistance without discrimination. And here, obviously, it needs to be fully ingrained into all the policies at the national and international level that will be created to attend the needs of, in a differentiated approach according to the needs, as I say, by gender, age, and the condition of disability, the condition, sorry, the English word, so it's only one. So just to finalize, I think here, obviously, as the gender focal point, we have some priorities. The first one is to examine how this effective participation of women has been done. Obviously, we now know of 3 presidents of the TPNW, and the 3 presidents have been men. There has also been, the coordination committee has been overrepresented by men also. So I think we need to really, within the TPNW dynamics, and to reflect on how we are implementing this preambular commitment. I think the second aspect that we need, and we're working with UNIDIR and with academia also to build upon the previous scientific work that has been done with regard to the impact of nuclear weapons on women and girls. We obviously want to engage in this aspect the scientific advisory group that was created within the TPNW. And so, for example, I can say that from the lifespan study of survivors of the 1945 nuclear weapons attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the diverse communities exposed to nuclear testing, the developing and dying from cancer due to ionizing radiation amongst women and men is highly differentiated. And there are also impacts with regard to fertility and impacts within the effects on girls, on their development, that they have an increased danger of problems and while they are maturing. And the third aspect is the TPNW decided now in the MSP to have an analytical perspective of what is to further critique the nuclear deterrence policy, and from different perspectives. And I think one of the perspectives on which we obviously have to study is from the gender's perspective. What does nuclear disarmament policies and doctrines of nuclear weapon states mean from a gender perspective? What is the vision of security, how it relates to, let's say, patriarchal structures of a security perspective, and how the nuclear disarmament movement focused on the humanitarian consequences is more focused on a cooperative spirit and a means of trying to avoid these forceful dynamics of security that have characterized nuclear deterrence. So this certainly, it is one aspect that also needs to be studied, and to also keep studying how to integrate the gender and age perspective in victim assistance, particularly while developing the national measures. So I think I would leave it here, and just thank you so much again for the invitation, and obviously I'm welcome to be engaged further in these discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. Alonso, thank you so much. I just wanted to, one, thank you for listing the three integral perspectives and talking about what's at stake. What does this mean for international security? What does this mean for redeveloping structures of how we even thought about security, how gender perspective now plays a role? And I love those points. I just wanted to re-highlight and re-emphasize that. And we do have some questions towards the end for our panelists. So Alonso, we will get back to you on some of those points, maybe to expand. But until then, I wanted to now start on our more roundtable discussion on gender and nuclear weapons. With that being said, I would like to start with Senator Marilou McPhedran of Manitoba, Canada. And for everyone who's wondering, their bios will be posted in the chat. So if you are interested to know more, you can go there for reference. Senator, thank you so much for joining us, and I will give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Stella. And may I just do a check on sound? Can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay, great. Well, greetings to everyone from my hotel room across the street from the UN. Today is the closing of the Conference on Population and Development, and it will come as no surprise to anybody on this call that there was a huge gap among the various country representatives on the question of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And there's an interesting intersection here between the question of individual bodily autonomy of women, women's choice all around the world in many different situations, and the relative exclusion of women in a pattern. I think that I want to particularly thank you, Alonso, for an excellent historical summary and pointing out that we have seen phenomenal women's leadership. Certainly, Elaine White Gomez from Costa Rica, the chairing process that went on in the developmental stages for the treaty. So it's not a matter of no women. It is a matter more of the systemic nature of multilateralism, that there is this machine that grinds on, and very often, if we're not diligent and vigilant, the machinery just makes sure that a gender bias continues on. The other thing I would note is that as greatly appreciated as the TPNWB references on gender are, and I think that was a true significant accomplishment in that drafting process, we're still left with a binary. And in very many places in the world, including places where they're putting their lives at risk, we have gender fluid or gender diverse leadership on this issue. And unfortunately, the binary language makes it even more difficult to take an inclusive approach. I also want to just observe that I work in a place, the Senate of Canada, that is only the second Senate in the world to achieve gender parity. And as important as that is, it doesn't actually get you very far. When it comes down to, again, responding to a lot of the systemic forces that really institutions tend to change people, it's much harder for people to change institutions. And that includes in relation to women in leadership positions in traditional patriarchal institutions. It becomes extremely difficult to bring about changes. So where we have seen changes, where we have seen women able to move into leadership positions, where we have seen, as we have in the TPNW, a change in the drafting, we know that extraordinary efforts are hidden behind those surface representations. And I want to acknowledge the many generations of women before me, and I'm probably the oldest person on this panel, that influenced the kind of work that I was able to do as a feminist activist and a human rights lawyer. And that, again, this cannot be a discussion that assigns women a certain higher virtue status than men. This is about values. This is about working together with the values that focus on the threat to our planet, the threat to civilizations, and the no greater threat than this to our climate, to where we have to live on this earth. And the kind of gender alliances that I'm talking about, I do want to take just a moment and acknowledge that I come from Treaty 1 territory in Canada, and it is also the homeland of the Métis Nation in Canada. And where I work as a senator in the capital of Canada, the Parliament of Canada is situated on unceded, unsurrendered land of the First Nations, of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. And much of the leadership in Canada on climate justice and on the bigger questions such as militarization, including nuclear militarization, has been strongly influenced by Indigenous leadership, and I would say in particular Indigenous women's leadership. And I want to pay tribute to my Indigenous sisters for the courage, the clarity, the visionary leadership that they have provided for decades and decades. And one of the most helpful reminders from our Indigenous women leaders is about how their form of leadership is about looking forward for 7 generations, and the importance of not making decisions on the expediencies of the day, or even the simplicity sometimes of an economic reason to go ahead with something without doing that far-seeking, far-reaching analysis of what the impact is going to be 7 generations from today. And as part of my reference to Gender Alliance, I really do want to say a very special and warm hello and appreciation to my fellow Manitoban who's on this call, in addition to my panelist, my co-panelist Rooj, and that is David Newman, who has been a leader in my home city of Winnipeg for decades, both in politics and in civil society, as a prominent lawyer, but probably equally or more important, a prominent activist, peace activist, and has brought numerous innovations to our community through Rotary and the establishment of Rotary Peace Partners. And Rooj may decide to say a little bit more about that. But the youth engagement, because I think that's also a very important part of what we're here to talk about today, is the intergenerational work that we need to do together. And it is the kind of initiative that we have through Rotary Peace Partners, entirely community-based. I will say to you that prior to becoming a senator, as a professor of human rights and dean of what was called the Global College for a period of time at the University of Winnipeg, much of the teaching that I was able to do was actually inspired and supported by community partners like Rotary Peace Partners, led by David Newman. So that's a highly personal comment, but it's also a very important example of one of the key points that I wanted to make here. And that is that it is very important to bring gender perspectives, but it is essential that those gender perspectives be informed through intersectional analysis, so that we have a much greater appreciation of the strength that is gained when we take the time to use an inclusive model and to be respectful with the kind of language that we use and the opportunities for participation, sometimes we have to work a lot harder to create those, not only the offers, not only the invitations, but the actual mechanics of engagement and full participation, and how valuable an investment that is for the longer term. My closing comment, because I know we've got a lot to discuss among ourselves on this Zoom today, but my closing comment is picking up again on what I said earlier about we cannot take just a simple binary approach to this. And we need to remember women helped to produce the atomic bombs. That in anything that happens, this is something where there are all kinds of reasons why it's not just women versus men. And there are all kinds of reasons why we have to be able to unpack the forces that are at play that will very often corral people into a place where the way out is through dialogue and making and building relationships. And that is one of the great benefits of Zoom, one of the great benefits of being able to come together online, that we can now have meetings that can actually engage thousands when we used to only be able to have meetings in person that maybe engaged hundreds. And so I think that although there are terrible risks with using technology, particularly tends to be much more in the way of harassment and abuse that is directed at women in public life. But the opportunity to grow the understanding and the message, I think there's a huge range of opportunities that we've only started to explore in terms of increasing participation and engagement on this issue. And with that, I'll thank Reverse the Trend, and I'll thank the Foundation for this opportunity. The work that is being done is very important and very appreciated.
Well, so beautifully put, Senator. Thank you so much. And so inspiring too, coming from, that intergenerational perspective that you were talking about, and paying homage as well to, the Indigenous population. We do have someone from the First Navajo Nation on the call today who will speak after Rooj, who you also mentioned. But I just wanted to personally thank you for, those insights. And beyond the dialogue today, at least what I'm taking away from this personally is, how do we come about those conversations without the us versus them perspective? Especially thinking about gender, and in the feminist movement, sometimes you get caught in the sort of vitriol that is put towards, the patriarchy and bringing it down. But in reality, it's about multilateralism, and particularly in conversations at the United Nations, that tends to be a pillar that they talk about all the time. But here, and just hearing it from you in application of a gendered perspective into thinking about change and progress and human rights and the preservation of our planet, put a lot into perspective for me. So thank you for that. Wonderful. With that, I would actually like to pass it now to Rooj, who was just mentioned by Senator McPhedran. Rooj is a youth coordinator of RTT Canada and was actually integral in helping me put this panel together and fleshing out the idea. So Rooj, thank you so much, one, for working with me on this. And I'm excited to hear what you have to say and maybe talk about some things that you have done as a coordinator within RTT, and maybe just talk about your personal perspective as well. But I will give you the floor. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Stella, for introducing me, and thank you for everyone for having me be a part of this panel. Thank you, Senator McPhedran, for the kind words. And also, I think a part of my discussion today will be also touching on the intergenerational aspect of this work and why it's been very important for me to work alongside those who have come before me in this work and who have established the stepping stone for me to get to where I am now, and in understanding that it really is not something that you do on your own, and there is great strength in working through generations and seeing that a lot of the foundations that have been established many decades before still lay today, despite current generations lacking the concern and the immediate urgency that lies in nuclear weapons use. I think the important facts that have been brought up regarding the effects on ionizing radiation is so integral to this discussion on gender, and how women and genderqueer people, those who make up a very marginalized community, are affected to a much greater degree than others who are really leading and dominating these discussions. And I am currently also a full-time student at the University of Toronto, pursuing studies in peace, conflict, and justice. And a lot of my studies take a very key approach in looking at how we shape narratives. And that's something that I wanted to talk about today as a young person, and as a young person who has been in this movement working alongside everyone else for a number of years now, is that narratives and how academia is produced is such an important part of how people come to understand the effects of nuclear weapons on different communities, and how certain organizations like Reverse the Trend can actually utilize the importance of education in reshaping how we view these weapons. And kind of something in my research that I've come to understand, especially coming from feminist scholars, is kind of, we really want to try to veer away from only viewing women and children as this victimized group, and understanding that there is a lot of agency in them being present as actors. And I think this was touched on by Senator McPhedran and also Alonso in speaking about it isn't that there aren't those present in the work that's happening. And that isn't necessarily, that there isn't anyone at all. It's that we need to try to break down the binary and have it be more people, but not just in numbers, not just having women present in the room, but also engage, like what kind of dialogue are we engaging in, and what kind of information are we disseminating, and how is that information being spoken about? Something that nuclear weapons discussion has really been able to utilize on the side of supporting deterrence and supporting nuclear weapons use is that they have been very masculinized. And in the discussion of how we approach nuclear weapons, it's looking at them as these strong holders of protection and agency, and that they are the keepers of the world. And any discussions around denuclearization and disarmament have been seen as a more feminist or more of a feminine stance. And that really comes down to how our academia disseminates this information, in that it is really in the wording, and it is really important how we phrase things, in that those who are new to this work will approach it with a kind of probably an already established stance, with everyone around them telling them that nuclear weapons are the reason we are safe today, when that really is not the case. And further analysis will show that nuclear deterrence theory doesn't serve that purpose. And many people are not aware of the gendered impacts. I mean, just today I was speaking to my younger sister who's 17 about this, and I informed her that there is a disproportionate impact on women and marginalized communities with nuclear weapons, and she had no idea. And I think that is really indicative of people who are very much not aware of a lot of the work happening, but they do have some primary already established understanding of who it is that's being impacted and what their use is actually serving the purpose for. And I think that's really important to analyze as a young person, and especially somebody in pursuing academia, is that we need to understand that it isn't just about including people in the discussions, but how are we framing the discussions to begin with? What kind of information are we releasing to people? And how are we building the narrative around nuclear weapons and who this notion of victimhood is? And that kind of segues into this idea of Western countries who typically own nuclear weapons being seen as the rightful keepers of nuclear weapons, and those who occupy what we call the global South as being the other, or not having the same amount of agency to be able to say the same and be part of the discussion in the same way. And that is a very prevalent narrative that we see in our media, that we see in academia, that we see in our classes and in discussions. And that's something I've been very fortunate to see kind of be broken down through these discussions I've been able to participate in, and through the support I've received over the years to be able to engage in these discussions. My first time attending a UN discussion for the first meeting of state parties for the TPNW was sponsored by Rotary Club. They were able to bring me to Vienna and be a part of it. I was 18 years old at the time. This was only a couple of years ago, and it really, really shaped my narrative of where I could fit in diplomacy and in these discussions, and that this perspective that diplomacy and civil society may not necessarily always work together is not beneficial to the work being done, in that civil society, although many might not fill these positions of power within government, within the United Nations, still have so much important experience and knowledge of the topics being laid out, and especially bringing in Indigenous perspectives and those from these frontline communities, in that although they might not fill the same positions on a international standpoint, their lived experiences speak for themselves. And that on its own is such an integral part of this discussion, in that we can't let who we see as the rightful keepers of these weapons and of these narratives, who decide how we masculinize the terms we use and how we talk about these weapons, be the only people who judge what we do with them. And in that, those that are the most affected can really break down the binary. And there is a lot of benefit in how we frame academia and talking about gender, because it really shapes how people approach this, and stepping away from seeing weapons use and weapons disarmament as a feminized perspective, because it isn't. And it's something that truly is meant to transcend binaries. And that's something that in my work over the years, and also having advisors like Mr. David Newman, who is on the call today, guide me and kind of show me that although my incoming generation of Generation Z doesn't have the same sense of urgency towards the impact of these weapons, that is not to say that there's a loss there. And then we can see that today with how much protesting has really been powerful, and how there is power in connecting with those before us, and understanding that it is with their support that we can kind of break past these expectations, and that young people do have a place in these rooms. And especially when we're discussing gender, and really trying to break away from this othering or victimization, when really women have agency in this discussion, and a lot of the power in why these weapons have been able to be framed the way they are, and their effects have been able to be framed the way they are, is really the wording we've been using over the last many decades, and how we masculinize them and assert the sense of dominance and protection that these weapons inherently must provide, when they really don't. And it is a matter of human health, it is a matter of global health. And in my studies as a second-year university student who just finished my second year, I've been able to see that change slightly in academia, in that we've been able to break past that binary and kind of reframe the narrative and dialogue that's happening. And that can't have happened without those before me, the generations that have laid out the groundwork to put that academia out there, and to put those narratives out there, and to produce work as civil society, but also as those in diplomacy, to show this issue is not exclusive to people who are like most aware and most professional in it, and let's say have like PhDs to their name. This issue is very much a human issue, meaning it affects everyone, and everyone has the right to have a say in how this affects them, especially when it comes to women, genderqueer people within the LGBTQ+, and also the global South, and how we view that, and really who is seen as like the rightful owner of these weapons. So I think that's kind of a lot of my personal experience within academia, and really wanting to end the note that it's really important to engage with the generations that came before, especially myself as a young person, and making sure that we don't accidentally fall into the trap of segregating the two groups, and making it as if this is kind of the sole responsibility of a new generation to take on. But no, like there are people supporting that come before, and I've come to understand that and really see the value in that because of those that have supported me to get me to be just where I am today and for me to pursue fields in justice and peace. So I really wanted to kind of emphasize that and put that out there. It really is a pleasure to be able to participate in this panel and speak on that. And I've been fortunate to also have opportunities to speak with individuals like Tetsuko Thurlow, who is a very prominent activist and survivor of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's really conversations like that that break down that dialogue and show that it really isn't how we talk about it. And that has so much power, even if it might kind of be forgotten sometimes, but really dialogue is so, so important. And I've been very fortunate to do so in my capacity as a youth coordinator with Reverse the Trend Canada. And I really hope to continue doing so. And as well as, I don't want to forget to mention this, but I am also a part of Senator McPhedran's Youth Advisory Council. So for any of the young people in the chat, the two organizations I just mentioned are always willing to engage, and please apply, send in an application, because there's such an importance in getting more young people involved and engaging with the older generations and those who have established these organizations. Thank you so much.
Amazing, Rooj. Thank you so much. That was so beautifully put and so inspiring too. I came on to Reverse the Trend. I'm coming almost up on a year. I think it's been 8 or 9 months. And upon meeting Rooj and just realizing the sheer work that Rooj has been able to accomplish in her time here was so inspiring to me, and definitely your experience inspired me to stay, on the mission. Something as, I hate to say it, but as niche as nuclear disarmament, especially in Gen Z, we tend to have this fixed emphasis on climate change, here in America, it was Black Lives Matter for a long time, and now we're seeing protests all around universities. And where nuclear disarmament never really had a spot in those Gen Z movements. And so I loved what you said about reframing the dialogue and talking about, the intersection of, no, nuclear disarmament has a role in climate change. It has a role in gender equality. And it has a role in breaking down the binaries and transcending the binaries, honestly. And so I love how you put that in. It adds fuel to my fire in this movement alone. So thank you. Wonderful. And I wanted to now reframe and shift to talking about intergenerations. I would like to give the floor to Professor Esther Yazzie Lewis of the Navajo First Nation. Professor is the author of The Navajo People and Uranium Mining and is also an RTT advisor. So Professor Esther Yazzie Lewis, it is such an honor to have you on this panel today. Thank you so much. And I will give the floor to you, I think.
Stella, could you please just make Professor Esther a co-host, because I don't seem to be able to spotlight her otherwise.
That's fine. Excuse the tech.
Yeah, actually now it works. Perfect.
Wonderful. All right, Professor, after you.
Good morning. For me, it's good morning. It's good afternoon for all of you. Just wanted to say Yat Eto Aro Esther Yazzie Lewis in Shiedo. Tohe Glen in Schledo, but on the Bush's chain. Todich Dasha Chedo, Lashi Dasha Nale. And so I introduced myself by my clan and my languages that are still very alive, and we're trying to save it. It was the military code back in the 40s during World War II. I want to start off with a message from Lakota Chief Orville Looking Horse, And he says, a disease of the mind has set in this world leaders and many members of our global community with their belief that a solution of retaliation and destruction of people will bring peace. In our philosophies, it is told that we are now at the crossroads, either unite spiritually as a global nation or face with chaos, disaster, disease, and tears from our relatives' eyes. We are the only species that is destroying the source of life, meaning Mother Earth, in the name of power, mineral resources, and ownership of land, using chemicals, methods of warfare that are doing irreversible damage as Mother Earth is becoming tired and cannot sustain any more impacts. I ask you to join me in this endeavor. Our vision is for the peoples of all continents, regardless of their beliefs in the Creator, to come together as one at their sacred sites. I read that to you because as Native American people, we look at the planet as Mother Earth because she provides everything. And we look at Father Sky as we need the sky in order for the planet Earth to be in existence. And we look at the sun as the Father because without the sun, we won't have light or nourishment to our vegetation and to even our life. And we look at the moon as our Mother Moon because she controls the movement of the air and the water. And so we all are born through water. And we incubate through the 9 months of our creation in the water. And I was asked to speak, and I was asked to be an advisor for Reverse the Trend. And I come with a perspective of how do we, as women and female of this continent, and identifying how we relate to the earth as our mother and how we're nurtured by our mother and how we're nurtured by our father. As Navajo people, we have distinctive roles as what is the role of the woman and what's the role of the man. And I see that I'm with an organization called Southwest Research and Information Center. And with Southwest Research and Information Center, I have learned about the impact of uranium on our Navajo people. I have learned that the mining that took place developed the bombs that hit Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I have learned that the Navajo people regret that they ever dug the uranium just for that purpose as warfare. I have learned that my people are affected by the contamination of the radiation that was in the mines, and that where their families were taken to the camps where they mined uranium, and the children played not knowing that those tailings were hazardous, or the water that they brought back out from the mine that was so cold and tasted so good was full of radiation. And so people are impacted like that. And the abandoned mines of 500 abandoned mines that have, where companies have gone and left and never covered the mines, that when the rain comes, the water flushes all that contamination down into the arroyos, and wherever the tracks of the water go, the journey and the paths of the water, that people are affected by that water, and the water is contaminated. I spoke at the University of Cincinnati, and they asked me to talk about the contamination of the water. As I looked at it, dividing the Navajo Nation in half into 4 quarters, I realized that 3/4 of the Navajo Nation was polluted. Their water was polluted. And so we don't have clean water. We don't have infrastructure of water to give to the families and homes people. I worked the water settlement and I understand those things. And so I come with the study of the birth cohort study with Southwest Research. As the birth cohort study then deals with the young women who are 18 and 45 to look at how babies are born and the longevity of the impact of uranium, and finding out that Navajo people to this day are still affected by uranium with their health impact. And you find that these studies started because people were coming into the hospital and never knowing that these things were hazardous. And so now the children of the very families that were minors are now being affected with their generations that are being born today. And so the babies are then tracked to see what kind of birth defect, mental state of mind, their own development in their physical being and their cognitive thinking and things like that. So that's where, we're at. People that are working with the Navajo Health Department, the people that are working with the Center for Drugs, what do they call it? CDC, Center for Drug, what do they call it? CDC anyway, I can't think of it right now. And so it's a study that includes the University of New Mexico, and the government is involved, the state is involved, the private organization is involved. And the only thing that I can tell you, and I'm listening to all of you talk about the systematic and the institution changing and how do you change policies and stuff like this. I know with Navajo people, it isn't the government that's saying certain things impact of this uranium. And I just think about how our people have become, I want to call it the forgotten people, because we don't have an impact on the state or the government. All we do is our impact is on our health. We have hospital bills, we have these things. And so we're not privileged to have the benefits and the services of how do we clean up our environment in our community. We're Native Americans. And so as Native Americans, the systematic issue is that, we're of a brown skin, and our people have become to the point of, the government doesn't care. Nobody cares about our health. We have to do it ourselves. And so Southwest Research is an organization, a nonprofit organization that has gone out, that has reached out to the University Medical School. And now, because of them doing that, they are studying through this birth defect. And also, not only that, how do you find solution and balance to these ways of destruction of health? And so you find that we got into the zinc study of, your DNA is being affected also. And so we have come to a study with using zinc as to balance out how the body has been affected. And so I have a lot of things here that I could say, but my time is going, and I think I have only 3 minutes. So I just feel that our young people being in this birth cohort study has helped not only us, but I know that other third world countries and around the world look at us to see what the Navajo people are doing with the impact of uranium. And we're kind of like the key model of doing these things. It's like I said, it's not the government that's helping us. EPA isn't helping us. The Navajo EPA, our tribal government, isn't helping us. It's the health centers that are looking at these kids and monitoring them from the time the women are studied from the time they're pregnant, and how their pregnancy goes, and then into having bearing their child, and then watching the child, and all of this all the way up to, I don't know what age they go to, but they check them for maybe for a year to see, you know, just the different kind of defects that might happen. And, you know, it's the disturbance of cell divisions and the reduction of immune systems and things like this. There's a lot of repercussions of how the uranium impacts the body. And so not only the body, but I say the land and the water. So, you know, our children that are being studied are now, you know, how do we deal with young people and the generations to come. So we're not done with it. Like I said, we're trying to see what our solutions are. And one of the studies is zinc. And so I just was thinking about this morning and thinking about it during when I first was told if I could speak on this and how women were even miners themselves down in the mine and how they were affected and how they contributed toward, you know, these things and to their own home and to their own life and to their own well-being of their kids. Find it, it's a long process to reverse what has happened. And I want to end with, I'm looking at my time. I want to end with another quote by Chief Orville Looking Horse. He says, "We were warned that one day you would not be able to control what you have created. That day is here." In other words, the devastation that's created, we are here and we don't have any control. How do we change policies? How do we change institutions? And there's a lot of, like I said, institutional racism where people don't, you know, we were supposed to be extinguished at one time. They weren't able to do that. And so they put us in boarding schools to assimilate us. And now we're assimilated and we're still here as Native people. And we have to deal with these, and people call it historical trauma. And I think that we still have to fight and see how we can change policies. And it's not easy. It's hard for us to change policies for our own well-being and sustaining ourselves, but we're working on it. And I work with a group of people called the Nest Center Research and Evaluation. And we look through the Navajo, the Ne lens. We look through our own lens to see how we should resolve these problems. And a lot of our members to this organization have gone on to college, have gotten their bachelor's, their master's, their PhD, their Juris Doctoral. And we're looking at how we can use our own way on a spiritual level. And I think that this spiritual way of doing things is the only way that we can look at these things, because scientifically it's this, but what is the spiritual part saying for Native American people? And I work with the Lummi Nation up in Belmont or Bellington in Washington State. And they bring together canoes and we look at the ocean and the movement of the currents and the spirit of the water and the spirit of the trees and the spirit of the air that controls all of the movement of the natural order. And it's a beautiful thing. And we try to restore how Native people need to take care of these things so that. Thank you for letting me speak.
Wonderful. Well, the honor is really all mine, Professor. Thank you for joining us and offering that perspective, which is just invaluable. As a double theology major at my university, when you talk about the spirit and the way, I really resonated with that. And we had just recently in class talked about the idea of a universal consciousness and talking about this interconnectedness among, you know, a shared species being human beings. And when we talk about the issue of disarmament, when we talk about institutional racism, when we talk about perspectives that are just not widely shared in the ways that they should be, I think at the end of the day, you brought in a great point in talking about the spirit and the way. Well, this is one thing that we can at least all agree on, that we all have in common, whether or not it's vocalized in policy or infrastructure, that this is something that we can look to in the larger grand scheme of things, is that interconnectedness of species. And that I think Rooj also brought this up, that this is a human issue, right? This goes beyond, of course, the frontline communities must be paramount in these discussions, as these are the people who are suffering effects of uranium, suffering ionizing radiation, suffering, high rates of cancer because of it. But this is an issue that affects all of us. When one is suffering, then all of us are suffering. And this brings me to my first question for all the panelists, and perhaps we can go in order, or if this resonates with one panelist individually, then feel free to jump on. But the idea of infrastructure and change, what do you think is the best way to go about this? We heard multiple perspectives. Heard from Rooj, it's reframing the narrative in academia, that trickle-down effect. What do we associate, right, with nuclear weapons, with protection? We also heard from, obviously, Professor Yazzie Lewis that it's about not just the perspectives, but I mean, if government isn't going to listen to you, then who do you turn to in those moments? So perhaps we can go in order if every speaker would like to contribute, but ultimately, how do we, I guess, reshape our infrastructure to accommodate? Is it about policy, or is it the communities, or is it a mix of both? I'm curious to know.
I think you're inviting me to respond. Yes?
Yeah, yes, whoever would like to.
Well, I think that perhaps one aspect that I can contribute to the discussion is as a parliamentarian, as someone who for the past 7 years has been engaged in lawmaking. And the bottom line here often is that people reference government in a singular way, when in fact it is an organism with many, many aspects to it, many appendages. And the only lawmaking, though, can be done by parliamentarians. And that puts us in a particular place of privilege and also huge responsibility. And the lack of accessibility that many, many activists at the community level feel deeply when it comes to governments, whether it's their local municipality, whether it's their state or province, or whether it's their national government. And generally speaking, we see a greater connection between those who are elected locally. And I want to note here that Rooj was one of the young leaders in my home city of Winnipeg, Manitoba, who convinced the local government leaders to pass a very important motion declaring the city a nuclear-free zone. And that was youth activism and leadership, but it was also youth leadership on a platform of intergenerational support. And it's true that getting a resolution at the local level for the kind of changes we want to make, so that we actually have mechanisms that are going to drive change, that's a very important step. It doesn't get us to the national level. And perhaps because my work has been in multilateralism for several decades now, I do want to reference both the opportunities and the limitations of trying to bring these issues to global governance in a situation similar to what's going on across the street from me right now with the Conference on Population and Development at the UN. And I think for the intergenerational advocacy that I believe is the only way we're going to be able to move forward, that we really do need to be skilled in our understanding of what multilateralism can do and what it can't do. And this ties into the lack of accessibility, or the perceived lack of accessibility of governments. That you have a system that was set up only for governments. I mean, that is the beginning of and the design of multilateralism. Civil society was, although present, for example, at the founding of the UN, the actual participation and the membership is always by government, by countries. And it's been a battle in every multilateral institution that I know of. It's a battle for civil society to reach a place where they are actually given voice, where they actually can appear and speak, always with very strict time limitations. However, what we see, and I wanted to place some of this discussion within the multilateral context of women, peace, and security, and youth, peace, and security. And of course, we have a cluster of Security Council resolutions on each of these themes, and how important it is that we bring them together, and that we see in Security Council Resolution 1325 from the year 2000, the drafting, that is the first time that there was a Security Council resolution that was entirely developed in its initial complete draft by civil society. Those were women leaders, primarily from the South, that built that resolution, which has now been grown to include 10 Security Council resolutions clustered under this theme of women, peace, and security. The youth, peace, and security resolutions are more recent, and bringing them together is something that's not yet a fully developed process. And with the limitation of these kinds of resolutions, this international treaties, Security Council resolutions, we already know that none of them are, quote, enforceable. And we know that because the very nature of multilateralism is to not have a majoritarian dominant model of decision making, to use consensus decision making. And I'm not here to talk about any kind of perfection in any of these multilateral agencies or institutions. But I do think that when we see multilateralism, the UN as a specific example, but not limited, under so much attack from right-wing forces in the United States, in most countries now, where there's a very strong push to withdraw totally from any kind of multilateral discussions, decision-making. If you want to look at the UN and the fact that we have the TPNW as a result of the UN, we have the major treaties that inform a lot of the activism that happens on the ground. And there's a serious crisis going on right now where at the UN in Geneva, for example, which is where all of the human rights discourse takes place, the escalators aren't operating, the elevators aren't operating, the meeting rooms are being closed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There's no money to continue. So when we talk about mechanisms, we do need to keep in mind these mechanisms that actually allow the kinds of conversations and development of treaties and declarations that inform our work on the ground.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator. And if anyone wanted to jump in, maybe respond to Senator McPhedran's comments, now is the time. Right. If not, we can move on to, I think, the next question. And I think using, Senator, your points on talking about, government feeling like an exclusive body, right? We talk about inaccessibility. And I think it's important to note Professor Yazzie Lewis talking about in the Indigenous perspective, and the Indigenous, I think even more appropriately, the lived experience, right? It has felt very, exclusivist, in that there's been a need to turn to local research groups, universities, health clinics, and things of that sort. And so maybe perhaps Professor Yazzie Lewis, if you wanted to talk about, your own experience of how you are getting your own personal community involved in these discussions. How do you inspire people? Is it that people are suffering health effects that moves them to want to seek change? Is it something that you see in your own community? And Alonzo, Rooj, if you wanted to jump in on this point as well, the floor is open. But I think that's something that is important to note here, especially for young activists trying to recruit friends, right, or recruit family to, I think, not only acknowledge the cause, but fight for it. What are some sort of mechanisms that you employ onto your community?
Well, it's hard to, as you all are talking and you're all on the Zoom and the list of people that are on that have a desire and an interest to motivate and mobilize and move to change policies, to put out the message and to do things. I was looking at my people and I said, Southwest Research. Southwest Research is a nonprofit organization, a non-Native American. It's an organization where the executive director is a non-Indian who has an interest in stopping uranium waste, which we call the WIC program. Carlsbad, and he's against it. And at the same time, we're dealing with the Navajo uranium, so they have another person that's specifically working with the New Mexico side of the uranium impact, but now has moved into Arizona because of the different and how our Navajo Nation government is not really effective in making those changes to a better environment, to say. And so we did, as community organizers, a collective of community organizers that have come together, we have put a moratorium on mining uranium contamination of water and things like that. And it hasn't happened. And we're going to have to go back to the Navajo Nation, and we go under the Bureau of Indian Affairs with the United States government, the Bureau with the Interior Secretary. That's where they deal with Native Americans with this country. And so there of red tape and political red tape that extends into different directions that bombard everything to really change and move. And we've been living this way. So I'm saying 50, 60, 70, 80, now we're in the 2000. That's like 70 years. And that's why I said we're the forgotten people. We have an attitude like nobody's going to do anything for us to do it. We don't have the mechanism of tools and the wherewithal to have to. I don't know if he'll ever get cleaned up, but those are things. And then we have the birth cohort study, and we're trying to stuff with health people. It was saying that they were going to clean up the contamination, and then a new president comes in, and money was all directed into another Navajo people. The Navajo people told me, we're just telling our story again. We're done telling our story. We don't want to hear it. Nothing's going to happen. And I kept saying, no, this is different fun. We got money. Then when the money was diverted somewhere else, they were right. Nothing happened. And then I feel like I was really hopeful that something would happen. It did. So government, I don't think, and I said that, I said we were supposed to be extinct because we're Indians, and our land was supposed to be taken. So, you know, we don't give any money, or there's none of the money that comes from us, but the raw resources that are under the land that we live on is what they want. But we are extinct. They wouldn't. It's hard. It's the attitude of our people to get involved is hard, but we are trying, we are moving. We did hold in, I think it was 2005, 2006, we held the World Uranium hearing in Window Rock, Arizona on the Navajo Reservation, and it was a great successful turnout. We got the Uranium Film Festival that comes out, and then I got involved with Reverse the Trend with Christian and the young people, and then they asked me to be advisor to them, and I'm thinking, I'm an Indian woman, how come they want me to be an advisor? You know, what do I know? But I've traveled the world to talk about what happened with Navajo people in uranium mining. I went to Africa. I've gone all over the place, to Europe. So I understand at a level that most of my people don't understand. And so I think this is a great endeavor. I did send 2 young people to the United Nations, and I never got a feedback on how, you know, if they talked about their, you know, way of life. I thought that would motivate them, and I would have some Navajo people with the youth group for Reverse the Trend, and it didn't happen. So I mean, it's like trying to drag a horse to drink, but it doesn't want to drink. So it's hard. It is hard, and attitudes of people and the way that things are being resolved is hard.
Absolutely. Professor, I share the same struggle as you. And I mean, not in the way of obviously the, you know, Indigenous struggle of, you know, seeing failure after failure after failure and losing hope in a cause, right? When you don't see actionable change. I mean, that is, as a human being, is disappointing. And it's a letdown to think that your efforts led to something that turned out to be nothing. And I feel a struggle in a sense of trying to bring that horse to water, right? And trying to make it drink, and trying to get young people to come to events and just listen. It's an uphill battle, but I think, you know, when I think of friends like Rooj, right, who I think maybe might be of the minority, right, who seek proactive change and put themselves out there in uncomfortable, you know, fora where the majority of the room is much older and has PhDs to their name. That's an intimidating feat. And so at least when I see and hear from people like Rooj, it inspires me. And maybe that's what needs to happen. Maybe it's a youth forum that needs to happen. Maybe it's, you know, going to Navajo land, if that is an invitation that's welcome. Maybe it's having a youth dialogue in New York over Zoom. But it's hard, you know, and I think that's something to take away from this dialogue as well that we're having today, is that beyond the gender perspective, how do you motivate people to commit to the cause, right?
Well,
and
you know, let me interject something here. When I was working out by Grand Canyon with Navajo people, and I seen some young people, I said, how do you feel with your land and water contaminated with uranium? Their thing was, it's normal.
right.
You know, we drink the water, we live here, we don't have any other place to go. You know, there's nothing wrong. So I was like, wow, there is something wrong. The water is not clean. You have to haul water from 200, 150 miles to 200 miles just for home use, just for your livestock. There are Navajos that haul water from long distance just to have water, clean water, one that's standardized to the quality of drinking water. We don't have that on our land.
It's a human rights issue, and it's, you know,
Exactly.
it defies dignity. And I see Alonzo, maybe did you want to jump in on that?
Yes, and well, obviously it's very difficult to come after Esther and what we've heard of the experiences of the Navajo people, of course. And I think here, obviously, trying to respond to your question and what mechanisms to really broaden the understanding, but also the importance of the issue in the international community and also nationally, obviously. And I think, well, first and foremost, we start with the experiences lived by these marginalized communities that have suffered the terrible effects of the diverse aspects related to nuclear weapons, from the mining of uranium, as was explained in Canada, to the nuclear testings in New Mexico, and which is also Native American communities that were the mostly affected. I think also Setsuko Thurlow was mentioned, and obviously all the victims of Nagasaki and Hiroshima and their experiences, and of the Pacific. And obviously, I think building from these experiences of those directly affected from the nuclear weapon use or nuclear testing, then obviously we have to, as was said by Rooj, and I think also by the senator, of understanding the intersectionalities of nuclear weapons, trying to bring them outside of the scope of merely this security perspective and this security narrative. And that implies, obviously, bringing also the issue to other fora in which they are analyzed under different scope, under a different light. So the WHO report on health, the human rights resolution on the need to compensate victims and to understand their needs. It implies in the General Assembly, it implies to bring it in the human rights, in the environmental domain that has another dimension, both in the effects, for example, in the oceans that are still now suffering the consequence of nuclear weapons and the contamination by radiation. And also the possible impacts of climate change, the other great danger to our survival. And I think that we have to also make it much more aware of what the nuclear winter would imply and the grave consequences of any nuclear war. And we also have to link it with academia. I see Mary Olson is very active here in the board, and obviously we value enormously the work that she has presented in the humanitarian conferences, and I hope to invite her to one of the meetings of the Gender Focal Point. And I have discussed it with Renata Delacqua of Unity. I know she's working with them. But so this intersectionality that was mentioned, I think obviously it is important. And I would also like to kind of reflect on what the senator mentioned on, and I think also Rooj said, of not seeing it merely through this binary scope, women, men. And that's, I would like to highlight that multilateralism grinds in a slow velocity. And obviously, we have to understand that the growth of gender perspectives with regard to international peace and security conversations that have taken over the last couple of decades, we understand it's still met with various degrees of skepticism and even opposition. And within the nuclear domain is no exception. So obviously here we have to understand that the only avenue to keep building on the understanding and the progress on the gender perspectives, it's through dialogue, through conversations, through solving the misconceptions that exist on the issue and engaging in good faith conversations with an open mind. and allow for the gender lens to clarify and to avoid box checking exercises and to really raise awareness among youth experts, such as all that are participating here. So I think here it is, I think another youth seminar I participated, I kind of said, like, when you're building a house, usually all the instruments and the materials to build the house are not found within where you are building, but you have to bring them from outside. And I think here, this is the value of these conversations that we had, and this is the value of the TPNW, the engagement with civil society, the youth, the Gen X, that obviously by bringing ideas, bringing material, bringing instruments, the house will be built in a stronger manner. So, and I think this would be my comments.
Well, let me add here. There's a book out that's coming out. It's called The Dirty Secret Lies of Nuclear Power in an Era of Climate Change. And I was asked to do the book review, so I'm on that book too. So there's another book called The Critical Scientist, and that I'm in that book too. So if you wanted to do more on, you know, what my points are in uranium, there you can look me up in those books too.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for availing those as resources. And thank you everyone for your contributions. We do have, I think, just a few more minutes. I think it would be a great time if there was any audience member. I know the chat is very active. If there was anyone who wanted to ask a question to any of the panelists or get any clarification, you are more than welcome to take this time and just use the raise hand feature. And I can look through on anyone here who might have any questions or comments. And also be wary of the chat as well. We do have some emails and resources that are being put in there for your use as well. Okay. Well, if there are no questions or comments, I would like to thank all of our speakers today for presenting wonderful perspectives and helping to facilitate this dialogue. And like Alonso said, it's, you know, these conversations, it's bringing in those outside materials, those outside perspectives to form, you know, one cohesive house, one cohesive unit of change, and perhaps one understanding of where we're going from here. So thank you so much to all the speakers for your time, for your patience, and for your words of wisdom. And thank you to everyone who stayed on this call as well. I know we've been here for a little bit of time, but it really does mean a lot to have your presence here. Wonderful. And so with that, you are more than welcome to sign off. And this meeting is recorded as well. So it might be posted in the future if you guys wanted to reference it for any endeavors. Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Well done, Stella, for the moderation. And it was an honor to be with all of you on the panel. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye, Senator.
That was
Thank
good
you all
information.
so much. You were wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Stella. That was amazing.
No worries. Thank you. It's good to see you even